Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this continuing series about the intersection of psychology and philosophy. Is there a difference between the two? How do they complement each other? I think there's a vital complementary relationship between the two, but I didn't start realizing this till very late in my therapeutic relationships, of which I have many. I hate to say, I was a little promiscuous in my therapeutic life, but I'm very pleased to
Good
have
for
Gena.
you, as one needs to be. Yeah, go on.
It's okay. That's a good thing.
It's
Okay, good.
actually a good thing.
Oh, good. So who you just heard here was Dr. Gena Gorlin. I just want to say a little bit about you. I think you're awesome. Clinical associate professor in the
Ditto.
Department of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, where I feel like every objectivist on the planet is moving, or am I wrong?
Yeah, no, there seems to be such a trend afoot.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it's a
maybe
bit
I
of
mean
a
you wouldn't know it from the pro-Gaza stuff that was going on there, but it seems like it might be a new Galt's Gulch. I don't know. But Gena, you're a practicing licensed psychologist and a coach for entrepreneurs and other ambitious innovators. And you publish tons of academic and popular articles researching. This is interesting to me, the moral psychology of self-creation. I love that. And you write a popular Substack newsletter titled Building the Builders. Now, when you did, welcome, by the way, I want to just extend a
thank
formal
you.
welcome to you
So
and
happy to be
say
here.
I'm happy to have you, believe me. And I know you're super busy, so we won't take a whole lot of your time. I mean, so I'm going to ask a question that I don't know if it's too broad to ask, but
Yeah,
is there a difference between psychology and philosophy? If so, what is the difference between the two?
great question. Yeah, it's a great question. I just taught a class on it, or the first class of an intro to psychology course for the Ayn Rand Institute. So very much dealing with the question of where does philosophy end and psychology begin, and the overlap, the distinction. Yeah, I mean, so of course philosophy deals with a lot of psychological topics. Do we have free will? What is the nature of concepts? How, reason as man's means of survival, right? Like that's such a psychological insight. We need self-esteem and purpose, right? So a lot of, since it's about the human being in relation to their world, right? Man in relation to reality, half of that subject matter deals with the mind of man. So of course philosophy heavily deals with psychological topics, as it deals with, you could say, physical, right? It deals with physics insofar as it provides fundamental kind of metaphysical premises like existence exists, and consciousness doesn't have primacy over existence, right? And like magic and mysticism aren't real, right? So like it's also, you could say, laying the foundations of the natural science. I mean, it's laying the foundations of the natural sciences, of every science, right? By prescribing kind of broad epistemic norms, and by spelling out kind of really general, universal facts about the the world we live in and the beings that we are. But where psychology kind of picks up, the mantle, is where we get more specialized and where we need more specialized study and inquiry, systematic observation, systematic data gathering, systematic inference from that data in order to really understand the workings of the mind. And turns out there's a whole lot to do, at that more specialized level of inquiry to understand this incredibly complex, entity uh, and existent that is the human mind, which is connected to a body and which has a subconscious and which has associations and memories and perceptions and sensations and and emotions that can be rewired but need to be rewired in particular ways over certain amounts of time, and where the conditioning, where the external context really impacts how all those internal processes unfold, and where our volition operates within certain parameters, and we develop over time in ways that require a careful study of the child across stages of development, and how that differs by culture and how that differs by genetic predisposition, all of which turns out to make some kind of difference. But it's a question of what kind and at what points and how malleable. So that's really where the science of psychology picks up.
Now, it sounds to me like the science of psychology is very coherent from your point of view, but from my point of view, as a person who has been on the other side, who's been on the couch, I found the science of psychology to be not so scientific, and or to be
Yeah,
split into two different camps for
just
me.
two.
Oh, well, that's
Well, well, there's more
from
than
my
two,
own
unfortunately.
from
But
my
go
own
on.
limited experience. Well, I split it into these two types of camps: the mystics or the materialists. So for me, it was like there was the Jungians and the Freudians who I actually got a hold of me, and they attributed lots of my feelings and sensations and neuroses to what I would consider now to be mythical narratives that have nothing to actually do with what I was experiencing, or very little to do with that. And then there's the neuroscientist types, like the Sam Harris, who you're entirely a biological vessel. Everything that happens to you
Yeah,
is a matter of chemistry and the cause and effect of chemical reactions. And so there is no, in the one sense, you're a victim of drives and or mythical elements that are far outside of your moral agency. On the other side, you're a victim of material elements that are far outside your
that are
moral
far
agency.
outside your moral agency. Right.
No one
They're both
talks
the
about
same.
moral agency, really. I mean,
Well,
let's talk about that. Am
present
I
company accepted. No, no. But so a couple things. So first of all, you're picking up on what is a definitely a kind of historically rooted dichotomy within the field, but it's interesting that you've picked up on it through the conduit of these fairly kind of pop cultural, in the case of Sam Harris, like he's not, I don't think most psychological scientists would sort of like even truck with him as like, oh, he would consider him like he's a scientist. He's one of us. He's like out there being a popular
Well, that's good to
figure.
know because he's
Um,
influencing the culture. So I'm glad
oh,
to
I
know
know.
that the scientists
Oh,
on
I
the
know.
inside aren't on the same page.
Yeah. So, well, which doesn't change the fact that he's influencing the culture, right? That's
Right.
still very real. But in any case, yeah, I mean, and there are certain things that he's good on, but like these are such mixed bags on every side. But anyway, but I'm very much with you on the stuff where he's quite bad and beyond what you would find within the academy in terms of like kind of more measured and more like data driven, if nothing else, kind of accounts of how we think and how we learn and so on. So that's Sam Harris on the one side, who's like almost like a reductio ad absurdum of one bad school of thought within psychology. And then you've got your Freudians and your Jungians who, in my experience, who vary so widely that it almost becomes laughable to try to lump them all in under one school, although they all sort of get labeled to some extent or another as psychodynamic or kind of falling under that broad umbrella, to the extent that their kind of loyalties are more with like with that half of the field than with kind of the more quote cognitive behavioral quote evidence-based half of the field. So there's definitely this broad divide, but like there are plenty of psychodynamic theorists and therapists. I've worked with some of them as colleagues who are much more who so I wrote a paper about nurturing agency via awareness, or it was called Agency via Awareness, a meta process in psychotherapy, with a psychodynamic therapist and researcher. So like that's one example, but we also cited a bunch of other researchers within the psychodynamic sort of literature who also were very much pro agency, pro sort of empowering individuals to be their own conscious, agents, and through self-awareness, through insight, really kind of taking charge of their lives. So lots of psychodynamic therapists and theorists will very much fall more on that side. Like, no, we're pro agency. They're the behaviorists and the reductionists. And then there are plenty. So Ben Dura, Aaron Beck, and Stephen Hayes, who's in the third wave school of therapy. He developed acceptance and commitment therapy. Marsha Linehan, who developed dialectical behavior therapy. So a lot of the pioneers and the people on the quote behavioral side are also all about agency. And they've kind of rehashed or kind of recombined some of the original concepts and frameworks and and done a lot of empirical research and observation with actual people, which I think grounds their theories to some extent, such that they've arrived at ideas that in many ways are empowering of human agency. Marsha Linehan talks about how you can change only once you've accepted reality. So she has this whole dialectical behavior therapy concept is it's a kind of packaging of the serenity prayer, God grant me, minus the God part, the serenity to accept what I can't change, courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Like she's all about how to do that and what are all the psychological skills, social, interpersonal, cognitive, behavioral skills involved in being able to do that, including, accept the past, as the past, you can't change it, accept, the fact that you have these problems and these flaws today, and then get on with actually changing them, with taking responsibility for yourself and for your fully lived life. She wrote a memoir called Building a Life Worth Living. So I just want to, put in a good word for, like, there's a lot of good work that's happening in psychology, even though ultimately we still haven't escaped these sort of buckets that are still operating under false dichotomies that we've inherited from philosophy.
Now, this is an important, that's what you said was interesting to me, because you said part of her philosophy is accepting the past because you can't change it. Now, one of my therapists, I don't know how I would classify her, but she gave me Alice Miller to read. I don't know if you ever read Alice Miller, Drama of the Gifted Child. She did several analyses of psychological analyses of dictators like Ceausescu and Hitler, Stalin. She might have even psychoanalyzed. And she had a couple of interesting points about the German culture that enabled Hitler to come about. But the Drama of the Gifted Child is her seminal work, and I think she originally wrote that and presented it to Congress as a testimony to child abuse, and it sort of changed the way people look at child abuse from just flat out neglect and physical abuse to its sort of mental abuse and more subtle things. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is because her perspective, which my therapist put on me, which then affected my relationship with my mother for a very long time, was you can't just accept the past. You have to grieve the past.
Oh, yes.
You have to openly grieve it, and then you have to you mourn it, get through that thing, and then you can get past it. Now, is that a truth?
Yeah.
Because okay, that's true. You do have to do that.
Well, hold on.
Okay.
I'm nodding in agreement with aspects of what you're saying, and so it is often the case that there's grieving to be done around any kind of loss, any kind of dramatic shift in our lives and how they're going to go from here, whether that's, the death of a loved one, where grief is most, kind of paradigmatically needed, right, and appropriate, or a breakup, or in some cases, the loss of the life that we feel we deserved and wish we had had, or the love that we sort of pined for and maybe never actually had, but we're sort of holding on to as an ideal, as an aspiration. And at some point, we need to sort of cut ties with that version of our, aspirational reality and life. So I think there's absolutely grieving to, just like if you think about, to relate this to a kind of philosophical or objectivist context, if you think about like needing to deautomatize a habit or deautomatize, like a context, used to believe in God, and then I, thought it through and realized there's no God. And then it took time to sort of automatize my atheism, to kind of stop constantly fearing that I'm going to go to hell if I screw something up, and kind of having to remind myself that, wait, no, I don't actually believe in that anymore. That's just a habit now. It's the same thing with like having to de-automatize. If anyone's ever been through a painful breakup, you have to learn you kind of learn a new mental model of your life where that person is no longer in it, right? And there's a bunch of habits that correspond to expecting them to be there, right? And you've got to unlearn those habits, and grieving is part of that process of very consciously, and a big part of grieving is also like really appreciating and acknowledging, even paradoxically, savoring in some cases, like the love that was there, the value that was gotten, from that relationship. Or in some cases, like I really wanted love. I wanted, I'm someone who really values intimate, honest relationships. And so I wanted that with my mom, and to accept that I never really had it. And I'm not saying that's true for you, but just from your story, like one way that might have played it, like to accept the reality where I never really had the love that I sought, or where it went away for reasons that weren't, up to me. It's going to take time for that to really sink in. And it's going to take some grieving of the loss of that love that I, thought I had and that I wanted, or that I had at one time. And part of that is like being serious about our values, right? Like I do value honesty and love and intimacy. And to that extent, of course, this hurts. It should hurt. It would be weird if it didn't hurt.
But the way you describe it, it feels like the grieving is a very guided process. Like, you know what I'm
It
saying?
can
Like,
be.
guided in the sense that somebody who you express lots of nuances in that grieving process that I didn't necessarily experience at the time. I mean, it rolled over, for either Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, sort of stages of death kind of
Which
thing.
also not very scientific. Just want to
Not
throw
very,
that out there.
not very scientific, but also
But
this
gesturing at
therapist.
something real. Yeah.
This
Yeah. Yeah.
therapist gave this to me as a sort of guidebook for, the
Sure.
various stages that I would probably go through experiencing, but none of the nuance, like you just said, cherishing the love that grieving process meant to you. It almost made me cry when you said that, because I felt like, because it's very personal to me, because I had such an explosion of grief and anger at my mom, who was my primary caretaker, for all the stuff that I had experienced with her and with other men that she had brought into my life. That, when she got sick and passed, and as she was dying, I remember hugging her close to me and thinking, what the fuck was I so mad at? And is it possible, and maybe that's just a rationalization or just something, that a sentiment that I had because of what was happening, but is it possible to de-automatize without the more overt manifestations of grief or rage, or going through whatever those stages
Sure.
are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing I wanted to say. So I'm glad you're raising it and bringing me back to it, which is very few of these kinds of processes, these kinds of needs are universal. Like psychological universals exist at a much wider level. It's like we all need agency and, a sense of our own efficacy. We all need to reason our way through life, right? Like at that widest level. And then the moment you get any more specific, like we all need to grieve. No, some of us don't need to grieve, and some of us experience it very differently than others. And I think it's very easy to generalize, and we see a lot of generalizations getting thrown around based on somebody's particular sort of psychological lens or framework or school of thought, where like this is actually something I've been seeing in Silicon Valley circles. It's an interesting trend of late, where everyone is suddenly on about trauma. Like everyone, apparently, even like the VC, the investors who are hearing the pitches, that first time founders, early stage founders are giving to like 90-second pitches, or, brief intro calls, where normally it's like cut and dry, like tell me about what's the, sort of value proposition here, how much of a market, how much can I make, from your company. Like suddenly VCs don't want to, venture capitalists, they don't want to talk about your company, they want to talk about your childhood. Like something is like, there's like something in the water in Silicon Valley, and I have some guesses about what or who it might be, but like everyone's traumatized, and your trauma is what's going to inform how you run your company and what kind of leader you're going to be. And so we need to understand your trauma. And to me, like that's just wrong. It's just false. It's just patently false. Not everyone is traumatized. Plenty of people are not traumatized. Even if they've experienced things that might be traumatizing to someone, people emerge without any trauma. Like just depending on their temperament, depending on, just like the meaning that they make of it at the time, depending on who else they have around and how they're sort of, processing and prioritizing those different relationships. People are resilient. People differ vastly, in their reactions to any given type of experience. And so there's just very few universal prescriptions someone can give. Like you have to grieve, or grieving has to include XYZ.
Do you think culture is teaching us that we have to be traumatized, though? I mean, I feel like people are getting a certain social status by by exhibiting to the world that they have experienced a certain amount of trauma, and not only just experienced a certain amount of trauma, but it's irreversible. There's nothing that can be really done about it. Do you
To a
think
certain,
that
at a certain level? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
so the culture, I feel like the culture feeds a sort of mental illness, right? And it robs you of agency because it's as if the trauma that you've experienced commands you. There's really nothing you can do about it. It's in you and it defines you. So
Yeah,
with a
a lot of
given
that.
the fact that we have that intersection, that culture of intersections, right, where it's all about abuse and oppression and trauma and how much trauma do you
Yeah.
have? How can you, as an individual, I don't want to say struggle against it, but arm yourself against that while you're also dealing with your own, I mean, I don't want to say fragility because I believe in anti-fragility, but your own problems and issues and fissures
Yeah.
that you need to fix.
That might be very real. Sure. So I recently wrote a piece on this for my Substack, not to just, do a shameless plug, but it's on this topic called Your Flaws Matter Less Than You Think is the name of the piece. And I wrote it specifically to counter the cultural narrative that you're talking about. And I think it's a kind of two-part narrative. There are like two heads to the same, ugly beast. And like one of the heads is when someone is great, it's because of their trauma. Their trauma, like you said, it defines them. It's what makes them great. So it's like, depression breeds great art. I'm sure like as an artist, right? And being in the film industry, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this like mantra of just like, you have to suffer for, you've got to be a mad genius, a crazy, like everyone in Hollywood has bipolar disorder. I've actually heard that cited as like, just like a fact on this. Just like genius is born of suffering and trauma and mental illness, which is so dead wrong that it's like hard to even wrap one's head around how wrong it is, but it's just kind of believed. So that's one. And then the flip side of it, yeah, which is like our shadow work has to take priority over everything, right? It's like like this kind of self-help, like healing, mental health culture has taken on, which I think is a big part of what you're describing, like this kind of moral stature almost, where like you are like your worth is measured relative to how hard you've fought against your traumas or how much you've had to, how much shadow work you've had to do and how vulnerable you've been in the face of all the pain that of course you've suffered, because who hasn't suffered a bunch of pain and had to, deal with all these fissures. So I think both of those things are in the culture. I mean, they're one thing, but I think they kind of just rear their heads in different ways. And my kind of counter narrative really comes down to your flaws are not, flaws being a catch-all for like mental health issues and struggles and, whether it's depression, anxiety, trauma, just like disorganization, poor social skills, whatever your particular issues, they're not fundamental to you. What's fundamental to you are your virtues and the life you're building, like what you can do, what you've achieved or what you're on a path to achieve. And you can do things, you can build, you can thrive, you can be a virtuous person, you can be an interesting person, just have an awesome life, even with a bunch of flaws. And some of those flaws will be worth your time to override or to altogether, deautomatize, work through, spend time on in therapy, and some won't. And there's always opportunity cost to whatever time you spend trying to become, less easily triggered or trying to become, more immune to depression. Like you might sometimes just go through spells of depression, but like, can you learn to just keep working on what you're working on and like keep going out with friends even while you're feeling down? Because by the way, that's one of the best treatments for depression is just like
Yeah.
behavioral activation, aka going out and living your life. And so I cite Musk in that article as an example, which although I still have a kind of fraught relationship with some of the stuff he's on about, but like this guy's sending rocket ships into space, that are actually like he's doing unprecedented things for humanity. I mean, really, for himself because he thinks it's cool, right? But also like all of us are better off. Like we are on track to populate Mars one day because of this guy's insane ambition. But
Hmm.
like all that any of us care about is, that he's inflammatory on Twitter, right? Like, which is annoying. It actually is annoying. And it actually, I would argue those are real faults, but like context, like, are we sure he'd be better off spending the hours in therapy working on those faults that instead he's spending on running SpaceX and Tesla? Are we sure? And like for
Right.
him, do we know that that's a better use of time? I don't, so
I don't want, and I wanted to touch on this idea that your neurosis is your art. That's a very, very popular conception, especially when I first came into acting. My acting teacher's mentor, Sanford Meisner, a very famous acting teacher who came from a very famous theater company called the Group Theater, that basically taught everybody that you know in America, from De Niro to Marlon Brando, Pacino, they
wow.
all came out from under the tutelage of actors who formed this group theater. And Meisner used to say outright, neurosis creates art. But
There it is.
my own experience was very different. My own experience was, no, my neurosis makes me undersensitive and hypersensitive. It makes me completely out of
Yeah.
touch with reality. It may look explosive and interesting on stage for somebody for some things, but it also prevents me from going deeper. It prevents me from touching myself, from
Yeah.
knowing my values. It blinded me to reality. So from my acting class, I don't preach that at all. I think that's an extremely unhealthy way to look at life. The clearer I
Beautiful.
got, the better I got. And an actress I knew who was famous at the time for a TV show called We Got It Made, which was a sitcom in the late 80s or early 90s. I was trying to encourage her to go to therapy because she was so messed up. She sort of looked at herself as a Marilyn Monroe and had that sort of vibe going. I'm like, you got to go to
Oh
therapy,
boy.
kid. And she's like, can't
Yeah.
go to therapy. I won't be able to
Don't end up
act
like
if I
that.
go to therapy.
Oh, there it is.
I, I said,
There's
yes,
that whole
you'll be
mindset. You'll
better.
act
I was like, you'll be
better.
better. Yes, you'll be
Oh,
better. So
yeah.
I also wanted to say something else. Like you said, going out there in the world, going out with friends, can I still do that even though I'm depressed? Well, yes, you can. And that reminded me of an acting lesson that I teach that becomes a life lesson too, which is, and this is not like fake it till you make it. I don't buy
Mm-mm,
that stuff, but
mm-mm.
behavior begets feeling. Behavior
Yes.
begets feeling. So when you go out and
Act
invest
on what you
yourself,
know. Yeah. I
act
call
on
this
what
act
you
on what you know, right?
act on what you
Before
know.
you
That's
feel it.
that's
Yeah.
very good. And that action produces feelings because we're an integrate, I'm saying this as a normie, not like somebody like you knows,
But you're right.
but
Yeah,
it
no,
feels
you're spot on.
integrated, right? It feels
Yeah.
integrated. So you do something and you're going to make yourself happier. You're in the midst of a depression, you go out with friends, you can get out of it. You can see above the rim of that depression simply
Yes.
by behaving um, like you're compatible and
Like
enjoying
your
the
genuine
conversation.
valued self, right? Like the self, the authentic self that you can be when you're not under this distorting cloud of depression, right? Like the depression is not the authentic version of you, right? Like the depression kind of casts a shadow over your authentic self. So go be the authentic self, and she'll wake up and come out of hiding. Yeah,
That's
for sure.
interesting too, because a lot of people in the artistic community view authentic in a very specific way. It's like the dark thing. If you're the morose, dark, poetic character, you're
Yep.
authentic. And
Yeah.
didn't Rousseau have a vibe like,
The noble savage.
civilization sort of robbed you of your authenticity, which was sort of a savage, un, you
Right.
know,
Uncouth.
unbound,
Yes.
uncouth, unrational person. So people
Yep.
have that view of authentic, but what is
They do.
authentic? I mean, what is there
Yeah. Yeah.
perspective?
I mean,
What tell us
it's
what
a good
that
question because
is.
I'm sure that the way I use the word is sort of unkosher and not the mainstream usage, because I'm guessing something like what you're saying is more familiar to the mainstream, and I'm
Mhm.
pushing back on it, right? But I think part of that is there's a philosophical difference, right, between the Rousseauian conception of like what is authentic or like genuine, right, like true. What does it mean to be true to yourself, to be honest? And people will often push back and be like, well, but don't I want to be true to myself, which means that I should be brooding and like and fussy and frustrated because in that moment I feel really short-tempered and just like pessimistic. Well, is that your considered judgment of what's true? Even in that
Mm.
moment, if you had to swear in court, or if you knew there was a lot of money on the line, based on like whether your current snippiness matches the reality of somebody's intentions toward you in that moment, or of how, you know, good or bad your prospects are over time, like, would you swear to the snippy version of reality? Or would you actually swear to a brighter, sunnier, more, you know, goodwill, more benevolent version of reality that is just like not emotionally, you know, real to you right that in that moment, but that like you can muster the knowledge, you can muster the wisdom that that's actually what's true and real. In which case, what's more authentic? Is it to just react from whatever feelings of the moment happen to push you around? Or is it to act from wisdom, act from your considered reasoned judgment and understanding of what's really going on, right? Where, yeah, sometimes that might mean you override your initial urge to, you know, like insult somebody or to snap at somebody. But like you're doing that because you don't want to say something you'll later regret and that you didn't mean, right? Like we often look back and say, wow, I said things that I didn't really mean, right? And I really regret having done that. I said things I don't believe. That's not authentic, right? What's authentic is if you're able to capture the full context of what you know and care about in that moment and speak from that, which might mean holding your tongue sometimes, right? Like that's actually the more authentic thing to do.
That seems like that takes a great deal of training to self-training to speak with the full context of your life and your relationship with the person you're speaking with in mind as you're doing it, in the midst of
Yeah.
very powerful feelings or a desire to do harm to that other person. And
Yeah.
that does make
Hard.
that makes authentic, that raises the level of authenticity to me, because what the artists have been taught, I think, on authenticity is sort of an animalistic level of behavior.
Just like let it all hang out kind of
Yeah,
thing.
let it all
Just
hang
like,
out.
yeah.
And
Ugh.
that's as how boring, to be honest with you. It's so
Yeah.
passe. I'm done with it. But a real authenticity on the human level is so high. It's rising above the feelings of the moment, not denying them, but
Mm-mm.
understanding where they sit in the context of your whole life. That's
Yeah.
wisdom. That's wisdom.
Yeah.
So why
Yeah.
do I mean, so many of the therapies that I went to focused on feeling. And I know objectivists sort of have the opposite problem. I know objectivists who are really remote from their emotions, and
Yeah.
they're not in
Me
touch, and they
too.
use objectivism as a way of rationalizing the fact that they're not really in touch with their feelings.
Yeah.
But
I know them too.
despite all the chaos I thought that the feeling crowd gave me, it wasn't until I started to integrate the principles of objectivism that I started to feel psychologically clearer,
Hmm.
irrespective of who was in the chair analyzing me. Is there a reason for that?
Interesting. I mean, it does sound like you generally saw psychoanalytic types who
Yes.
weren't necessarily as informed by more recently developed cognitive approaches. Because if you were sitting in a, you know, CBT session, or, you know, like a session of cognitive behavioral therapy with somebody who's competent, because there are plenty of incompetent, there are probably more incompetent CBT practitioners. Well, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say that, but it's sort of like it's easier to get by as an incompetent CBT therapist than as an incompetent psychoanalyst, because you have all the like structure and scaffolding of like worksheets you can do and like rules, kind of like checklists you can go over together. So I want to say that as a kind of caveat. Like you may have had a lot of bad CBT, and that's not a knock on CBT. It's just a knock on the, you know, the therapists who are bad out there. Anyway, but good CBT, you would be constantly doing the work with your therapist of figuring out the premises behind your emotions and then questioning them, challenging them, checking them against reality, doing behavioral experiments designed to really put your, you know, put your beliefs, the ones that are pushing on your, you know, emotions, to the test, and then very consciously reappraising those premises, those beliefs, those automatic thoughts, as a CBT therapist might call it, in light of new experiences and in light of the full data set that you have available. So psychology has gotten really good at that, actually.
Does a therapist answer questions in that case? Because my last therapist, who I took to be pretty good, never really answered questions, and I felt like punching him in the face, because it was like, I want an answer. I literally don't have the context to be able to answer this question, and I'm searching for it. And is it right or wrong? I need to know if my feeling is right or wrong. And he always evaded a complete judgment of whether my feeling was right, reflective of reality, or just something, twisted up in my machinery that I needed to straighten out. And I was dying for that kind of guidance, and I never got it.
Yeah. I mean, so it's so funny. So there's dogma on every side. I mean, and you see this with objectivism too. There are plenty of people who are sort of like dogmatic about objectivism, right? So I don't think any school of thought is immune from this, right? So on the psychoanalytic side, there are plenty of dogmatic therapists, right? Dogmatic psychoanalysts, psychodynamic therapists who will never answer a question because, like, that's the rule, that's the dogma, and they're kind of taking it at that level. And there are plenty of CBT therapists who will always answer every question and be very directive, even though sometimes that's just the dead wrong move therapeutically. So it's a matter of context. Like, when is it actually, I sometimes answer questions, but I don't always answer questions that my clients ask me. And it's a very nuanced contextual decision. Like, what do you need from me right now? And do you actually need me to tell you this, or can you work it out? Do you already know the answer? Like, is this a skill issue? Is this a knowledge issue? Or is this the motivation issue, for example, and where can I sort of help move you forward?
I think after 3 years, he might have answered one question. I would have suspected that he was using that kind of, wait, I was gonna ask you a question and it just went out of my head.
Sorry.
I hate it when that happens, the pangs of getting older. No, you didn't. It's me. So wait, but I'll read a couple of questions here in the chat here, just until I can recover what it was I was going to ask, because I swear it was super important.
Then it will come back. It will.
Important to me. So agreed, says Rose Richards, about our topic earlier. And also, people project a lot of their issues onto others. Oh, I notice this a lot on social media. There's a lot of pathotypes on social media, and narcissists. How do you deal with, and this is just a total aside, since I feel like I'm dealing with narcissists on social media. How can you deal with a narcissist? Is it possible to deal with a narcissist?
Yeah, this is definitely a bugaboo of mine also. So I have to issue a disclaimer here, which is that narcissism has become one of these buzzwords, right? And one of these like cultural kind of hot, like flashpoints. And whenever that happens, inevitably there's like definitional drift. It just sort of acquires its own kind of stereotypical, meaning in the culture that isn't that grounded in observation or sort of, scientific study. So narcissism is a fairly specific thing. It's a personality disorder. I mean, and there are a few subtypes of it, right? But it's associated with, like an extremely defensive kind of coping style where there's pretty profound sort of self-doubt, or there's some sort of impossible and very kind of rigid standard of worth that somebody is feels themselves incapable of living up to. And the way that they cope with that is by aggrandizing themselves, or by constantly being kind of preoccupied with their own alleged worth and amazingness, right? And it's always sort of all about them because they're super insecure, and they're all they're on about that, right?
Oh, wait, you mean Trump really isn't great? Trump really isn't the greatest thing since sliced bread? It's maybe a narcissistic express. Okay.
I mean, that's one of the most confident diagnoses I can make. And despite not having personally met the guy. So yeah, no, I'm with you on that one. That one, yeah.
It's a defensiveness. It's a very insecure place to be psychologically.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you can see it. It's just like, what is the need? What, for all of this kind of like a bullshit, right? Like, what is the need for all the kind of self-aggrandizing and the denial of observable facts that don't match your preferred narrative, where you are this untouchable God figure, right? Like, why would somebody need to do that unless it's to patch something up, right? Or to cope with something that is not fully there. But there's a further question about dealing with them on social media. Or did you remember?
Yes. No, there is. I mean, I guess you can't, because the defensiveness is so ingrained. It requires treatment. It requires somebody to understand that they are defensive, so insecure that they've put up this grandiose facade, and the desire to fix it and go to therapy. There's nothing that you can do except to walk away, I think, is probably the
I
best
mean, I
thing you
think it
can
just
do.
depends. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the narcissist. It depends on your relationship with the narcissist, what you're trying to get from the narcissist. I've had plenty of delimited relationships with people who I, you know, never formally diagnosed, but may well have diagnosed as narcissists if I were doing a formal assessment on them, you know, and I've
Mm,
treated a couple of people who I did give formal diagnoses to. And in each case, there were various ways the person was hard to deal with for sure, and that I had to really delimit my interactions with the person for sure. But there were also ways, and I'm definitely not naming names, but I've had narcissist acquaintances, colleagues, friends whom I've learned a lot from because they're actually incredibly knowledgeable and smart. And
mhm.
when you kind of poke at them in the right way, that sounds dehumanizing. And I worry sometimes about just like we dehumanize people who happen to have this diagnosis formally or not as a narcissist. It's like suddenly they just become these boogeymen. But anyway, like these are still human beings. They're, they have a problem. They're not necessarily facing that problem in the, most virtuous way. And that's bad. But like, there are lots of other ways that we can fail to, virtuously face our problems, and we don't dehumanize all of those. So it's like become a little bit of like a boogeyman. But I've learned a lot from people. Yeah, go ahead.
This past therapist, I seem to be nailing this past therapist, but he wrote a paper on the fact that artists need narcissism in order to be good, which sort of harkens back to the you need neurosis in order to be a good
Same
actor.
idea.
No, you need
Yeah,
self-esteem. You certainly need
actually,
to think that
which is the
what you
opposite.
have. Yes, you need the opposite. You need to
You
think
need to
that what
think. Yeah,
you have to offer is worth
yeah,
value and that other people want to see it. And
yeah,
then, you can bear yourself with confidence up there on stage.
yeah. And
This
people just
sort
conflate these things all the time, which is just
and they
frustrating
conflate
as
them.
hell.
It's
Yeah,
frustrating as hell because it becomes a part of the social narrative. It's part of our cultural narrative now that sickness is art. That if you're traumatized, that has to define who and what you are forever and ever and ever and ever, as opposed to working beyond it, accepting it as a reality, and then maybe even realizing it's going to leave scars that, like in our body, prevent us from doing all the things we'd love to do in the way that a perfectly healthy person would love to, but doesn't prevent us from living life fully. I know I've had to redefine, you know, my concept of love and relationships with people according to what I'm capable of, some of
mm-hmm.
which is just understanding my nature. And
Yeah.
that reminds me, there's sort of a relationship between, you have to accept sort of where you are, but you also have to be aspirational. Can you talk about that? Because it seems sort of like, I don't want to say, it seems like a paradox that you can't do both
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, but you certainly need both qualities in order to get better psychologically.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so this is, I was gesturing at this with dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which is Marsha Linehan's big um, innovation. She pioneered this whole treatment that's sort of centered on that goal and that idea. That's the dialectic she's talking about. She's using weird philosophical sort of foundations that aren't good, but to justify something that is actually very good at the practical kind of implementation level. Um, but but more fundamentally, so not only are they not paradoxical, so and I agree they can feel paradoxical, they can sound paradoxical, but like if you think about aspiration, not in terms of this like need to prove something to some arbitrary authority figure that's like breathing down your neck, that is sitting on some divine jury waiting to judge you, right? In which case, it's sort of like the Calvinistic, like either I'm one of the chosen people, it's like am I destined for hell or heaven? Am I one of the good or one of the bad? And like everything I do is like a test of which one I turn out to be, and it's by some fixed arbitrary metric. If you throw out that whole way of thinking, that whole kind of deontological duty, based kind of detached, like um categorical way of thinking about ethics and about the good, and instead, become what Rand called a disciple of causality, in the sense of like, I have one life to live. I want to drink life to the least. I want to get the most joy and meaning and fulfillment I can. And it's my life, and I have about this much time, kind of remember the Rourke kind of conversation with the dean, where he's like, what do you mean? Like, I don't have anything else to learn at this institute. I don't want to waste my time. I have maybe 60 good years left, and I want to spend them building. And I know that this is what I love. I'm moving on to the next thing, because that's going to position me to make the most of my remaining time, right? Without accepting, in the sense of like doing a really honest, accurate inventory of your reality, of like, what do I have to work with, right? Like, what's the raw material, including my strengths, my weaknesses, how old I am, what I do or don't possess, the mistakes I've made that I now need to pay in some way to, to repair or whatever. Like, what am I working with, so that then I can build my masterpiece out of those raw materials, right? If you aren't open or honest, or, if you don't have an honest kind of inventory of the raw material, then you're in fantasy land about your aspirations, right? Then the aspirations are not real. They're not credible. You're not going to even, you're not going to be able to make a kind of credible causal model and plan for getting from here to there, if that makes sense.
Agreed. And your masterpiece, you shouldn't be comparing it to Michelangelo. You shouldn't be comparing it to Raphael. You shouldn't be comparing it to
Yeah.
Vermeer. It's your
It's not
own
their life you're building.
particular masterpiece that will look your way. And that's important, because a lot of people get caught up, I think, in these comparisons, and
Yes.
they end up being quite bummed out. I wanted to ask you about anxiety, because I think a lot of folks that I know, and a lot of folks in the fandom for Supernatural, complain a lot about anxiety. And I want to tell you a particular story of mine, and I want to see if what I did was good or bad. I used to suffer from these anxiety attacks that felt unbelievably awful, like they're terrifying experiences. And
Yeah.
then one day, actually in Paris, one day I was in Paris and I started to feel the anxiety attack
The
come
onset
on
of, yeah.
like a wave. And normally that would elicit terror, like, oh fuck, here it comes.
Yes.
Instead, I just asked myself this one question. I'm like, my body's trying to tell me something about me right now. It's actually,
Mm.
it's informing me about something. I want to
Mm.
listen. Okay, so I opened my mind and I said, what do you
Your
want to
inner
tell me?
ear.
My inner
Yeah.
ear. And
Oh.
I said, what do you want to tell me? And it was like diving underneath a tidal wave. The thing just passed right over me. I didn't necessarily get clarity as to what it was that set it off. I'm sure there was some physical characteristics that were
Yeah,
going on that
we
I
can talk
wasn't
about
aware of.
that. Yep.
But I wasn't, which I'm stealing from you, by the way, from your talk with your own, because that sort of made
Oh.
something clear to me. Um, but
Cool.
embracing it instead of fearing it, made it
Yes.
much, much less powerful.
I mean, yeah, that sums it up. That's beautifully.
So what are the causes of anxiety? Because you talked about somatic potential causes too when you were talking to Yaron, and people might not understand that because it just feels so visceral and so like out of the
I
blue.
know. I know. Yeah, I mean, so there's so much, yeah, I could say about this. So let me start at the wider level of what is like what's the cause of anxiety, or the cause that. So first of all, there's not one cause. People are genetically predisposed to more easily develop phobias and develop, generally kind of neurotic patterns of reacting to stressful events, to ambiguous events, to, like whatever happens to us that's kind of scary, or just kind of we're not sure what to make of it, or we're not sure how we're going to solve it, handle it, right? And we all have stuff happen to us, but like some of us are just predisposed to be more bothered than others of us. So there are
Right.
certain predispositions, and same goes for, like you're mentioning biological predispositions. Some of us have like a kind of just more reactive physiological alarm system, like our fight or flight system, our sympathetic nervous system. It's just kind of like, rigged to go off more easily. So like think of it, it's like it's got a lower threshold for activation. So, we might have the same sort of cognitive appraisal, like the same understanding of a situation as our, friend over here, but like we feel it as panic and they just feel it as like, mild stress, right? So all else being equal. So anxiety has many, many causes in the sense of like factors that can predispose us to it. But what turns like a fear or arousal or like sort of sensitivity of the kinds I'm talking about, what turns it into like chronic anxiety or like a pattern of anxiety is absolutely at least influenced by, and we know now really tends to be caused and maintained by how we interpret that initial reaction and how we're interpreting the situations that make us feel those initial, stressed or panicky or just kind of fearful symptoms. So, say we have some interactions at school where a kid is kind of, mean to us. And we feel we feel that sort of unpleasant internal kind of, we feel butterflies, we feel knots, in our stomach, our chest, feels hollow. And also, we're thinking to ourselves like, wow, I must have really screwed up that interaction. And it's almost arbitrary which comes first. Like, did we first somehow learn because, we had a mean, harsh, critical parent who always blamed us or always called us names, that we internalized as like our own interpretive, schema for why somebody might be mean to us? Or did we first just like feel those knots inside, and then the way we interpreted that is something must be really wrong and I must be really messing this up, right? But one way or another, we now form a belief, a premise, a schema. I'm incapable of, competently interacting with people, or the world is dangerous, or just like people are dangerous, volatile, not to be trusted, right? Or, you know, or like my body, my physical health is constantly at risk, right? Like so whatever it is, we form these beliefs through these experiences and how we process them. And now those beliefs become self-reinforcing through the avoidance that they motivate us to do.
Yes.
So when you were just saying, right, like you knew, oh, here we go, it's coming on. And the way you'd normally respond is by trying to get the hell away from it and like resisting it and pushing back on it, which of course then would just make it spiral and spiral and get bigger and bigger. Right.
Yeah.
And this time you just didn't do that, because the signal you're sending to your brain when you very naturally, understandably, like resist and are freaked out by the initial anxiety symptoms, the signal is, this is dangerous, this is bad, this is scary, I should solve this. This is a real problem for me. And now I'm trying to solve it, but instead of solving it, I'm actually just feeling worse, because of course you feel worse when you think something dangerous and scary and bad is happening. And now I'm even more out of control of these symptoms, which just reinforces that they're bad and dangerous and scary and I don't have control over them. And now I'm having a full-blown panic attack. And so it turns out that just changing the narrative, changing the interpretation, just as you did, like turning toward instead of away from it, which we actually do by design in the clinic by having somebody, for example, breathe through a straw with their nose plugged to just like bring on those symptoms on purpose.
Yeah.
So then they can be curious and turn toward them and listen to them instead of avoiding them. That turns out to be the cure.
So is
you
that
solved it for yourself, which is really cool.
Is that sort of also, do you let's say somebody's afraid of going to crowds. They want to go to a convention, a fan convention, but crowds terrifies them. Getting on planes and confined spaces terrifies them. Do you think that they should be exposing themselves to those smaller places with it's slowly until they become aware that those aren't threats at all? And so it's exposure to that. It's embracing it to change those synapses and conclusions that you have in your mind.
Exactly.
Or I guess
So
conclusions that have created cognitive behavioral therapy. Yes.
That
is
the
the
whole,
answer.
so for CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, consists of basically the two components we're talking about. The cognitive part is identifying what are those judgments, premises, and beliefs. Like, I believe that the world is dangerous. I believe that people mean ill, that people can't be trusted and I need to protect myself from them. or they can do me great harm. I believe that, if I'm on an airplane, I won't be able, I'll have a terrible panic attack and I'm going to cause the whole airplane to crash because, or whatever the case may be. Like, here are the beliefs. How plausible are they? What's the evidence I have to date? And now that I have enough of a sort of measured view, at least, like, probably this is exaggerated. Probably it's neither as likely nor would be as bad, as costly, as severe as my brain is imagining. Okay, now let me go test it. And that's where we go to do the exposures. And the exposures are what does the work.
I mean, Victor, I remember reading Viktor Frankl in his logotherapy. He had something called paradoxical intention that he used, which is very similar to turning into the thing. It's like, if you're afraid of, profusely sweating in public, just say, I'm going to be profusely sweat in public. You sort of embrace it. You say, I want it. I'm going to have,
you make it happen.
Yeah.
We literally will splash water on ourselves to be sweaty, and then we'll go out in public and then we'll see what that's like.
And then you sort of I guess disarm that fear by directly embracing it. I know we don't have that much time. There's one or two more things. Wait, do I have a question here? I saw a theory that says that trauma occurs when someone's experience presents evidence that conflicts with their established identity, and this disassociation hinders the ability to harmonize reasoning and emotional process. It made sense to me at the time. What do you think about this, and how do you think the emphasis on objective reality and self-esteem can help overcome this situation? That's a good question.
It's a great question.
Of course, Manny would always ask good questions. That's very good.
Yeah.
So do you agree with that occurs when someone's experience presents evidence that conflicts with their established? That sort of sounds like cognitive dissonance to me, and not so much trauma, but or is that a form of trauma?
Yeah, good question. So that is one manifestation, one example of, I think, the broader model that explains a lot of trauma, if not most trauma, and certainly with the sort of cognitive model of trauma, which I find very, credible, and which I've used to actually treat people effectively. And on the cognitive model, when we experience a trauma, what makes it an enduring source of distress and impairment for us is that in some way it clashes with our either pre-existing worldview, or so maybe that's our identity, maybe that's just like the general kind of view that things make sense in the, a really common view people come in with, and then trauma happens and then they get stuck, is good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, just world theory per se about their identity. But it's just like, I live in a predictable, just world where generally I can expect good things if I'm good. And then they get raped, right? Or robbed, or, something awful happens to them. And now if they're going to preserve the original narrative, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, either they have to throw themselves under the bus, like, I must be bad, I must have caused this somehow, it must have been my fault, it must be a punishment, right? Or then they have to throw out the original belief with the bathwater, where now, you know what? No, the world is not just unjust, but it's dangerous and bad and cruel, and I can just expect harm around every corner. And one way or another, they end up stuck because neither of those pictures of the world, is objective or true or workable, right? It's like, if you think you're bad, good luck to you, right? We know that that's not workable. And if you think that the whole world is dangerous and bad and unnavigable, good luck to you, right? So you end up stuck. And treatment for trauma involves first identifying that stuckness, like, ooh, okay, so you've got this belief and it clashes with either the world or with your prior beliefs or with your needs. Let's check it. Let's start. And part of that is also just like, let's go back and really think through, like, feel and think through what happened, because often we avoid. Again, avoidance is the maintaining factor for every form of pathology, basically, or psychopathology. So, like, we have, whatever the really kind of incomplete, fragmented conclusions that we drew in the height of emotional upset, right, and turmoil when the trauma happened, and like, it's not that nuanced, and it's not really, it doesn't consider the full context. Like, it was my fault, or it was his fault, and therefore everyone like him is automatically bad, whatever it is. And then we don't go back to rethink it because we don't want to have to face it again, right? We don't want to have to remember the horrible thing. that we are, retroactively interpreting as the complete upset of our entire worldview, right? And so it just keeps perpetuating itself. So a big part of treatment is actually go back and see what happened, like, reprocess it fresh and like tell the whole story from start to finish, feel the feelings and sort of do the grieving where appropriate to come back to our, first point, and like put it into context, like really see it in light of reality, and in light of, your own
And if you
resilience and worth.
and you come to the conclusion, well, bad things do happen to good people sometimes, and I was unlucky. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Does that cure the trauma? I mean, does that make it
You'd be
less?
surprised. I mean, not by itself, but when you
Right.
go through so for example, there's a 12-week treatment called cognitive processing therapy, in which you first retell the story, and then also start identifying stuck points. Like, what are all the kind of beliefs and ways of thinking about this, the day-to-day world, that have been, that I have concluded as the function of what happened. So like, I can't trust people. This must be my fault. I'm bad. I'm so broken. Nothing good will ever happen to me. Whatever that set of things. You start collecting them. You start checking them. You just start checking, like, is this true? Is there counter evidence? Is this an overgeneralization? Am I mind reading? Am I fortune telling? There's like a list of cognitive distortions that you can check. Again, like I said, there's all these checklists in CBT. It's like you've got a checklist of like, am I committing any of these logical fallacies? And then you also go out into the world and like try to open up to someone a little bit if you haven't been, and like, test the waters, see what happens, and then feel the feelings of like, wow, actually that was not the disaster that I expected based on what happened that one time, right? Like, and also I have resources now that I didn't have then, right? Like often it's just an overgeneralization from then to now, right? Like things that happened to us as kids when we were genuinely helpless, right? And just had no agency or very little, to now we're like, we're grown adults and we can just like close the door on somebody. We can tell them no, we can stop calling, we can not pick up their calls, right? So just realizing like, it's not the world that it used to be. And also the world is far, more expansive than what this trauma represents.
I love this concept in cognitive behavioral therapy that you have a checklist of things that allows your mind to be in the helm again, that allows you to be in
Yeah.
the driver's seat of your life, and checking your premises constantly, so that I can see how you can find your way out of the trauma that way. We have one last question here because I know your time is precious and I don't want to hold you here any longer. Do you think a person can work on their trauma and be free from it? I think everything you've said from
Yeah.
this perspective says yes. And even if life presents a trigger to this person, so if this person goes back to the old self, so
Which can
maybe they
happen.
have, it can happen. Even
Yeah.
even if you're in the midst of the cure, even if you're in the midst of doing the right checks on everything, you may fall
Absolutely.
back to the original position, but you're
And
still
that doesn't mean you can't come back on the wagon. It's 100%. A lapse
great.
need not be a relapse, and a relapse need not be a collapse.
Okay, so Ali, you
Okay.
have a
So,
question
Allie.
real quickly. I don't see you want to ask that question? Go ahead, but I'll make it the last question. Can you unmute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Go ahead. This is the last
Hey, Allie.
question.
Okay, so I deal with my own trauma and I've been dealing it with for 5 years. And I do stuff like that helps me like keep my mind busy, but I know it's not like a guaranteed process. And I'm not gonna lie, for the past 5 years, it still feels empty. It feels like a whole kaleidoscope of worlds are just crashing around. But and I feel like it has not improved even with therapy because it still feels like the same kind of empty, no matter how many like good things have filled with it. Um, it feels like it can't ever get better. And this is going through I like since last year as well. My dad died in 2019. And then last year my mom died along with my cat 2 days after that.
Oh,
And then I had another cat passed away. And so that has changed me greatly. I've become like severely emotional. I lash out at my friends and I don't intend to try to. And it's just,
yeah.
and then it just fatigues me to the point where
Yeah.
it's just like, I can't do this anymore. And I don't mean like that in a bad, negative kind of way. So it's just that it's just like gets me tired. I can't hang out with people. It just, even when I go to cons, like my friends are with me, they go and do things. I can't go with them because I get tired. So I was just wondering, how do you handle fatigue as far as like when you have like a cocktail of anxiety and depression going on?
Yeah. Yeah. So Allie,
Thanks
thank
for
you
the
so much,
question,
first
Allie.
of all. Seriously, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for, I feel like even just being able to get that dose of reality on this call, because it's so easy for us to have a kind of like casual, detached conversation about trauma and anxiety. And, like people could easily get the impression of like, you just go to therapy and you deal with it and you move on with your life. And that's just not the reality of dealing with, complex and recurring, right, and serious trauma. And so thank you for like just bringing perspective to all of us on that front. And I kind of feel like I want to go back to where we started with, Mark saying like apologetically, I have been, how did you put it with your therapist? Like I have been whatever.
I don't even, yeah.
Like
I
you've
don't,
seen a lot of therapists.
yeah. Oh, promiscuous.
Right?
I've been a promiscuous therapist.
Promiscuous, that's the
Yes,
one. And
yes.
me saying like, good for you, because that's sort of what it takes sometimes. Because the fact is like rarely do you get better in one course of treatment. Like that is very much the exception, not the rule. Rarely does one therapist sort of like know all the different interventions and all the different, like hacks and frameworks that in fact would, that exist out in the world of treatment that could help you. But like you're just not going to, unfortunately, and I'm working toward a world where this will be the case. But right now it's just not the case that you sort of like have a reliable, complete sort of expertise from any given practitioner. Like they're just not going to be aware of everything out there. And so it's hard, it's work, and it takes time, and you've been living that, reality, and it can be for sure exhausting. And I think, and I know, I guess what I can say here, in this brief kind of end of, interview responses, I have met and worked with and, had dear, precious relationships, therapeutic and otherwise, with people who have been where you are and been through what you've been through. And, if you can imagine, even more harrowing still in terms of just like the amount of kind of loss and the compounded grief and displacement and, and struggle. And I have seen them triumph and overcome. And not just that, I've seen them turn their struggle into grist for growth and wisdom. So there's the concept of post-traumatic growth, which is a very important sort of contribution to the literature in recent decades, I guess now. And there, not only, can you like overcome the trauma and sort of come back to some sort of, because you'll never be the same person. I think there's an illusion that, and this is where the grieving thing comes in, right? Like you're not going to be the same person that you were before losing both of your parents and two of your beloved pets and like having all this stuff happen in short succession. But nor do you want to be, because you now have all the wisdom and experience and like, and resilience, through struggle and just like knowledge of, what kinds of therapies and techniques and challenges and, and like the relationships you'll have formed in the course of working through this stuff. You now have all of that. And again, and I say now, like right now, it doesn't feel like any of this is a resource. It feels like a drain. But like when you're on the other side of this journey, on the other side, meaning like there's the critical mass of sort of techniques and tools and successes, wins through treatment and or through kind of self-care, self-education. There's enough wins that like you feel like there's now a tailwind instead of a headwind. Right now, it sounds like you're just facing headwinds, right? But at some point, the what is it? What kind of wheel metaphor? Oh my gosh, I always forget the word. The wheel that like you have to kind of push it till it finally takes off on its own. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, but I'm blanking on the name of the metaphor.
Can't believe
it's the wheel thing metaphor that when you push it and it takes off, it's yeah.
Here, you know what? I'm going to tell you because it's in my sorry, I know now I'm keeping everybody
not
over time, but it's the turning of the flywheel.
Flywheel. Yes, somebody just said flywheel.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you.
I told you she was a genius.
Yeah, you're right in the thick of like having to push the flywheel, and like gravity is against you. And at some point, there's a critical mass of experiences of like pushing yourself to like go out even though you feel like you're too tired. And sometimes it's gonna just suck. And then other times you'll be surprised, like, wow, that was weirdly fun. And I didn't know I had that in me. And like you need enough of those. And they don't have to be every time, but just enough of them that at some point you notice, oh, like I actually kind of want to go out. And I'm actually just like tempted now. Like now I have to stop myself from going out because I need to study. But what I want to do is go out with my friends because like that's actually become a more default kind of way for me to be. And like it actually now energizes me a little bit instead of draining me consistently. And that's where the effort will have paid off. And now the flywheel has taken off on its, now it's creating its own momentum, its own gravity. I've seen it happen many, many times. And you're not alone in that struggle. And and you're welcome to reach out for any further quick wisdom that I can impart, or like, therapist recommendations or whatever. But thank you for
Gena,
asking. And yeah.
Gena, I just wanted to thank you for coming on. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And I know you're so busy. We both don't have that amount of time, but you've actually made things very clear to me. I hope you made things clear to other folks out there. We're going to make this an ongoing series, so hopefully maybe sometime in the future down the line we can come back and continue the conversation. Please, please, if you can, read her Substack, Building the Builders, because we're builders. I mean, this isn't just for entrepreneurs, but I feel like we're building our own lives, our own character, our own self-esteem. Through philosophy and through psychology interventions, we can come out of some really, really dark places and actually experience the best in ourselves. And that's what I hope people out there experience. And I want to thank you for being a part of that.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. You're so fun to riff
Thank
with,
you.
Mark.
Thank you.
And
So are
yeah,
you. I hope to see you in the
delight.
future. Bye-bye.
Very much likewise. Bye, everybody. And happy building.
Bye.
Starting with ourselves.
Yes.